I'd like to preface this by stating that I am a person of colour who grew up in Naarm, which is known to colonialist maps and apps as Melbourne, Australia. And I moved to Scotland just in time for a fairly world historical and pretty uncool for immigrants event known as Brexit. So I moved from a settler colonial nation in which colonialism is everywhere in the expropriated land and the hasty buildings and the statuary, to one in which many old buildings and old statues tell the story of the mythologies that sanctified heedless expansionism and exploitation. One of the main things that brought me to the UK was game studies, a particular field of academic study that critically examines digital games. I'd published a range of works on games when I was living in Australia, enough for Aberdeen University, which is still my employer, and has the oldest games degree in the world, or at least that's what we're told to say by the marketing folks, and led them to take a shot on someone from halfway across the planet. So I vividly remember two anecdotes from my first year or so in the UK, in Scotland. The first is finding a spice shop, like I really needed to find some spices. And I remember the guy hearing my accent, as you can probably tell I still have a bit of an Australian accent going on. And I remember him saying, "Bro, do you even know how to use those?" I was like, "I gave you my money, dude. Like, just give me the spices. Jeez." The other anecdote, after that, we became pretty good friends. And, I kind of like had to think about it. And he actually taught me some new techniques and some new ways of using things that I thought I was super familiar with. The other anecdote is from the slide that I have here. It was the opening of a new museum in town, and they had an event for local educators, basically, to show the collection. And I remember going into the it's a design museum, essentially, where they're looking at materials and the history of materials. And I remember coming across this curatorial note. As you can kind of see there, many Scots made their careers and fortunes within the East India Company, providing career opportunities and new markets for manufacturers throughout South and Southeast Asia. Scottish entrepreneurs fully exploited these opportunities. All right, I was kind of clearly, you could tell probably that I was kind of like aghast at what I was reading. And one of the I was also the only person of color in the entire museum, as far as I could tell. And I remember a curator kind of like speeding over and trying to engage me in conversation about literally anything else. I think she could see on my face like how kind of a bit shocked I was. So this is kind of like just by way of two brief anecdotes to kind of give you a sense of being a diasporic subject. So you kind of like cop it from both sides sometimes, and you're always kind of like living in the knowledge that there will be something that shocks you into awareness of the fact, of your status as someone who's not quite, purely Asian, but also not quite, readable as a subject of the UK or Australia. Anyway, so like I like to kind of like grumble about these things sometimes, but this will kind of like become relevant as I go on. So it all worked out pretty well, apart from the whole Brexit thing. But there's nothing we can really do about that, and the pandemic. But 2021. Professionally speaking, I've taught hundreds of game development and computer arts students. We have pretty large classes, so that's been a really good privilege. It's like challenging at times. Because I'm teaching them like the more theoretical kind of subjects. I've published research on games, on narrative design, on science fiction, and children's gaming. That kind of like my main kind of like areas of research. So given the mixed audience of academics and developers here, I'm not going to be assuming too much familiarity with game studies as a thing, and I'll try to be talking through stuff as we go. So one of the main areas in which I've worked is diversity in game studies, and I'll be exploring some of the limits that I see in regards to diversity, both in practice and as a kind of a research topic. I'm a founding member of the Diversity Working Group in DiGRA, the Digital Games Research Association, and I was an organizer for the first diversity workshop at the Australian DiGRA conference in 2017. A special issue came out of that workshop in the 2 DiGRA journal that I co-edited with Sean Beavers. I've also been an organizer of the Keywords in Play interview series, a collaboration between Critical Distance and DiGRA that aims to highlight diverse game studies. So you can kind of see it here. This is the most recent episode that we have with Adrian Shaw, and it's turned out to be like just way more popular than I could possibly have thought before we started it. So it's gone pretty well, I think. So actually, this is quite an amazing opportunity for me to speak additionally, because I haven't told him this yet, but I had the idea for this podcast after a presentation that Carl and Isabel Lefebvre, I think, gave at the Games and Literary Theory Symposium in Krakow in 2016. So I remember their presentation. I remember thinking like, there's so much stuff happening around the world that I'm not kind of like plugged into, and I just wanted to kind of like create the opportunity for some of the more diverse kind of like voices to have another opportunity to speak. So thanks for that, Carl. So I think it took a long time to make that idea work. And it only worked because I already knew Jayemanne Street, who connected us with Critical Distance. And I was working at the same institution as our amazing PhD student, Emily Reed, who could jump on to conduct some of the interviews. And our awesome editor, Damien Stewart, who I met at the Philosophy of Games conference in Copenhagen in 2018. As a full-time academic, I would just not have time to be able to work on this kind of thing without a whole lot of help. And I think that's one of the things that is really important to recognize about trying to create these diverse possibilities, is just the amount of work that has gone into it. So again, like really thankful to Charlotte and Carl for putting this event together. So I'm telling you all this not to highlight anything I've particularly done, but to give context to how and why I'm speaking about diversity in game studies at all. And as someone who's worked on this stuff, I have a lot of respect for the folks who write under this banner and who work in this kind of a space. So even though I'm going to be critical of the term diversity, I'm like hugely supportful of and appreciative of the diversity workers and what they're kind of doing. So I have to, in terms of the DiGRA diversity group, I have to name check Aliya Sandova, who kind of led the charge to start up the group in the first place, and Marlianne Butt and Cody Meyer, who have been total superheroes in liaising with the DiGRA board and leading initiatives from the diversity group. So to give a little bit of a sense of why I think the term diversity is one that needs to be problematized, it's a tool that I've tried to work with for a while, and like any tool, it is fit for purpose in some contexts, but not others. One other point of this biographical kind of info that I've given is that I've often found myself in situations where I've looked for a tool that works and not found anything. The situation presented by Australia and the UK for people of colour in academia and games culture writ large is, difficult and fraught in many ways. The critique of diversity offered here, again, is not to disparage any work done already. So diversity is often seen as a term that connotes an inherent goodness, something that institutions and individuals should pursue as a matter of course. There are other terms that are often deployed as unalloyed goods in contemporary culture, like terms such as innovativeness, productivity, and creativity. But as we've been reminded so forcefully recently, and in so many different ways, reactionary forces can be very innovative, very productive, and very creative. I don't think diversity is quite in the same kind of like same box, but it still needs to be problematized, I think. At any rate, it's worth being critical of the way that diversity implies a norm that we are diverse from. Diversity is a concept that would like to not have to exist. If we're in a diverse situation, there would be no need to highlight or comment on it as such. It would just be. This is a quote from one of my favorites, Ruha Benjamin, and it is a bit grandiose to kind of like use this quote in this context, but it does relate in a way to how I feel about diversity in some respects. So diversity work can often wrestle with its own relation to the work that it's doing and its own future and the ways we should try to bring about needed change. Generally speaking, although it's not always the case in academic contexts, people do acknowledge that there needs to be some kind of change, but the way that we get there can often be really, really kind of problematic. Those of us who have done this sort of work wonder about how that work will be valued, if at all. It's so easy for cultures, institutions, and powerful individuals to look back on history and ignore the struggles and say, behold this diversity, aren't we so great, so magnanimous for having allowed it to come about? So as mentioned, I've done a lot of work on narrative in games. In fact, that was kind of the whole reason that I ever got into studying games in the first place. I've published a monograph that deals with the topic, convened an international symposium, and I'm a jurist for the IGF Award on Narrative Excellence. Originally, I was a literature student, and that, you know, the game stories, in combination with their other, you know, systems, was something that kind of got me into game academia in the first place. And I always wanted to think about them together, rather than thinking about how narrative in games are inherently different. One of the quirks of this line of research, and those of you who are academics will be probably rolling your eyes at this point, is that it has been a bit of a flashpoint scenario for game academics. The question of narrative functioned as a keyword for some academics around the early 2000s, by which they tried to distinguish games as an object of study from basically all other media. In a recent episode of Keywords in Play, as I said, I spoke with Adrian Shaw, who said something that I definitely agree with. Game studies often seems to forget that media studies exists. In that episode, she was talking about a paper in which she brings the work of the great kind of Birmingham School scholar, Stuart Hall, into proximity with digital games. And I couldn't agree with her comment more. In many ways, I've continued to think of myself as a media studies scholar who happens to write about games and not a game studies scholar as such. That said, I do work in a game development program, so video games have been my main focus just because of that. Now, these distinctions may seem small stakes indeed to folks who come from outside of academia, but the way that scholarly disciplines form and the group dynamics, which, of such, they're very important for how knowledge works in society. They're also important, almost kind of crushingly so, for individuals seeking to pursue a scholarly career. I'll come back to this in a bit more detail, as I've done a bit of work kind of bridging academia and wider social contexts. There's been a lot of work done on how questions of narrative functioned as a way for game studies as a field to be staked out and dominated by scholars of a certain hegemonic background. Some key studies include work by Emma Vossen and Amanda Phillips, which I've referenced here. These scholars, among others, have looked at the way that narrative became a divisive issue within academia and that claim towards a foundational moment. Phillips' paper, for example, zooms in on the first issue of the journal Game Studies, examining its component parts in relation to later phenomena in spaces such as the first-person scholar website and the Games Network mailing list. I'm very inclined towards these methodologies. Vossen uses small-scale ethnography and Phillips uses textual analysis, and the research findings have helped me make sense of important dynamics, experiences, and phenomena in game studies. However, I find that their findings do need to be placed in context. So Phillips indicates the importance of online communications to her discussion. And that was definitely one of the key characteristics of the first issue of Game Studies, that it was online and freely available. However, I have read countervailing views from diverse scholars who were involved in the early days of Game Studies, that Game Studies journal in the European context, who feel that these analyses don't take into account their own work on early issues of the journal. I'm highly respectful of both of these perspectives, but as a person of color who was working in a tiny country at the time, it's easy to feel like these discourses between the superpowers of the US on the one hand and Europe on the other, kind of like passed by what we were kind of like about in Australia around this time. The feeling that diverse game studies has to be positioned against a hegemonic and foundational set of work does make one want to put up your hand and say, diverse folks totally existed. We were doing work. There were alternate points of view. As someone who is enthusiastic about narrative, I know this is similar for many other scholars, it's always been disheartening that questions of narrative can be so rapidly wound up in this whirlwind of controversy and read as proxy for political questions. So often subsumed into what Tom Apley has called game studies dull binary. This is true also of other so-called foundational theories of play, such as the magic circle, and off-sided theorists such as Roger Kiwa, author of Banned Playing Games, and Johann Huizinga, author of Homo Ludens. Say, if you're a scholar who's just interested in this work, has a new reading or an idea with relation to them, the cultural climate around such ideas can simply discourage you from further developing that research trajectory. So I wrote about Huizinga in Fiber Culture Journal in 2009, and I've sometimes thought about returning to those ideas, but then I'm kind of like, it's really not worth it. As an undergraduate, I attended the 2003 Digital Arts and Culture Conference in Australia. I was talking about Ruha Benjamin in relation to games, and in 2005, attended my first DiGRA in Vancouver to present on cybernetics in games. After that point, my travel funding ran out. It's cost so much money to get from Australia to anywhere else, and so much time and energy. So I was kind of tied up in the local kind of more media studies, because we didn't really have a super robust game studies field there because it's such a small country. And as a diverse scholar, speaking about my own experience with relation to some of these ideas, my main problem wasn't narratology versus ludology. It was my more proximate concerns with the Australian Academy and the barriers to participation in discussions when you were writing from Australia. I've had conversations with the folks about whether one should teach ludology versus narratology when teaching game narrative. And I think reasonable people can disagree about how they run their classrooms. For my part, I tend to vary on the role of this debate in the classroom, depending on which classroom I'm in. I teach a game studies class where it is described as part of a lecture, and a reading may be set related to it. For a narrative design class that I teach, a different class, it's mentioned very briefly, and we quickly move on to more contemporary discussions and ideas. If I were to teach a graduate level seminar for folks who had a prospective game studies academic career in mind, so they did want to go down this path, especially, I guess for everyone, I think teaching that Phillips piece and some of the things to watch out for with regards to the way that scholars behave and finding a way would be something that I would teach for sure. Again, in discussing the constant revisiting of ludology and narratology as a foundational moment, I'm not contesting work that has examined the controversies so much as saying that if we want to challenge foundations, we should go wide. Why should we stop at this kind of like this one particular moment? And my advice was let's go towards media studies a lot more, go look at media studies, history, feminism, Marxism, post-colonialism. At the end of the day, game studies' views on narrative haven't determined my teaching or research as a diverse scholar of media. None of that discourse helped me to do good work. I wasn't reading ludologists much at all. I was more reading Angela Nadelianis, Esther Leslie, Miriam Hansen, Gregory Bateson, and others. A few other people have kind of like challenged this foundational moment as well. So Cameron Kunzelman and Michael Lutz have this proposition to replace Hitzinger with the writer C.L.R. James, who writes about cricket and theorizes that from a very materialist Marxist point of view. And Aaron Trammell's critique of foundational game studies theorists is another interesting kind of look at this stuff. So diversity as a term always means diversity with regard to some norm or another. I'm not convinced that narrative or game studies are well served by revisiting this moment. I do realize, however, that I'm kind of being a bit wishful in hoping that this won't be constantly rehashed. Part of the interesting thing about what Amanda Phillips has written is that she digs into some of the reasons why it keeps coming up. And some of those have to do with industry and the role of narrative in industry discourses as well, and that kind of coming into the academic discussion as well. It is difficult to say that things haven't got better with diversity in game studies. I do remember the 2005 Vancouver DiGRA conference being fairly diverse. Sometimes I wonder what happened to some of the folks that I lost touch with over the years. I do still know a few of them. Did they leave game studies or academia entirely due to some of the problematic dynamics we've been discussing? All of the people of colour scholars I know have battle scars from their engagement with the academy. Even though I'm currently in the saddle as faculty myself and not anxious about my personal future, I recall many times when I was this close to just finding something else to do with my time. And of course, I worry about these things for my current students also. As this symposium names, inclusion and intergenerationality is important within the teacher-student relationship as well. I've been to so many conferences in Australia, the UK, and Europe, where I've literally been the only person of colour in the room. I've looked around and wondered, is anyone else seeing this? And I would realise many people just don't register a lack of diversity unless it's actively brought to their attention. As Sarah Ahmed has noted in this regard through the concept of the feminist killjoy, the acts that we can take drawing attention to issues of diversity and inclusivity may not be particularly welcome. There's always an element of risk that goes into speaking up in such situations, and that risk assessment is a cognitive load, at best a psychic background process, and it can be almost like a constant source of actual anxiety. But it is constant and it's draining whether one speaks up or one remains silent. There have recently been many extremely positive developments, I think, with regards to diversity in game studies. There's just a few of the groundbreaking monographs that have been released in the last few years. I would also include, I think, like Shuvik Mukherjee has some of that coming out. Cameron Kunzelman has a book coming out on science fiction in games, and Brennan Keogh and Ben Abraham's book on climate change in games. A number of studies have been released examining the reactionary and anti-feminist hashtags and techniques used to attack feminist scholars by online groups. And just the last few months, new DiGRA chapters have opened up in Spain, Brazil, and India. But I've kind of like highlighted DiGRA a few times here. It's because that's the main org that I've kind of like dealt with. So I know a lot of great work is happening at HEVGA, Foundations of Digital Games, Canadian Game Studies Association, Association of Internet Researchers, and other groups. There's also some really great student-led journals, Press Start and Journal of Games Criticism, that give younger scholars the opportunity to learn about the publishing process and publish their work. I've also seen the increasing participation of disciplines and fields outside of game studies, creating research around digital games, So literary theorists, such as the Backles conference in the UK, cultural studies folks, and they're going to their important kind of theorists. They don't necessarily mess with this foundational moments of game studies. And as I mentioned, I've recently been principal investigator on a systemic review report for the UK Department of Digital Media, Culture and Sport. That's a bit of a mouthful. And that required me to get across a range of social science research. And I can tell you that those folks don't care at all what's happening about the latest findings in narrative and games, which is a bit of a pity, because I think if they did engage with some of the more theoretical kind of game studies work, their hypotheses would be much more kind of incisive, and they would be able to disaggregate player populations, which their studies don't currently allow us to do. On the other hand, some more engagement with sociological evidence and perspectives could be helpful for a lot of theoretical projects. And on the industry side, I think there are positive developments as well. As I've been involved in the IGF jury on narrative excellence, I've seen so many kind of really excellent, diverse projects go through. So the Umarangi generation from this year's crop, the reflectively political suzerain, and the exploration of relationships and possibilities across the grooves from a French studio. Just some really diverse, interesting, awesome stuff that we're seeing. In analog gaming as well, there's been important shifts, such as the success of the Asians Represent podcast and innovative use of platforms such as Twitter to signal boost diverse work, such as the hashtag RPGC, which highlights analog RPGs produced in Southeast Asia. However, there have also been troubling events that point to ongoing problems in the industry. One example is Battlefield 2042, where EA DICE developer Daniel Berlin claimed the game is not political, even though it imagines a near future scenario in which climate change and an intensifying refugee crisis have led to millions becoming countryless and so-called no-pats. We'll have to see what happens when the game is released to give a proper reading of it. But it's hard not to see this as a backtrack from the reception that Battlefield 5 received for prominently featuring women and racially diverse characters in its marketing material and campaign. Ubisoft's narrative director at one of them at Ubisoft, Naveed Kavari, came out with this pointed kind of like pushback, I think, for Far Cry 6, saying our story is political. This post seemed positive. However, it wasn't soon after this that in the wake of the news and litigation about toxicity of Activision Blizzard's workplace, 500 Ubisoft employees signed a letter decrying the company's lack of response to their own toxic workplace revelations from 2020. So all of these kind of like things are like deeply entangled with each other. And I think we need to draw on scholarship to help us think through these things. I'm thinking of Ruha Benjamin's concept of the co-production of technical, scientific, and cultural materials. So in game studies as well, there are signs that the positive developments in diverse scholarship that I mentioned before are tempered with deeper structural issues. Many of the diverse folks I'm in contact with are worn out, exasperated, tired at the ongoing systems of exclusion and exercises of power, which have shown no signs of going away. This is a research paper which kind of builds that out from a formal research point of view. I believe it was cited in the CFP for this symposium. So in calling us to go beyond diversity towards whatever's next, we'll need to recognize and reckon with these deeper systems in addition to the field imaginary that Phillips analyzes. An example from my own experience is the academic standard of double-blind peer review. For the non-academics in the room, this is where scholars read a paper without knowing the author and judge if it is up to standard for publication in a journal. This is where the practice of citation becomes important. As with good journalism, it is necessary to cite your sources. In humanities and social sciences academia, however, there is an additional importance to it, as the citations you use are kind of like a conceptual toolkit for the work that you're doing. So many times I've been asked to review a paper which contains no people of color scholars, even when I can name just off the top of my head folks who have written on the topic at hand. Now, if we know that scholars of color and other minority scholars tend to be less cited than their colleagues, how should we proceed? For example, I find Tara Fickle's critique of Kiwa in the race card to be very perceptive and convincing. Should I then insist that every citation of Kiwa that I peer review needs to cite her book and take that critique on board in developing the argument? Should a lack of diversity in the citations be a ground for a desk reject by the journal, thus preventing people like me from having to go through, this kind of labor? I'm not saying anything specific about how I actually review or have reviewed in the past, which is solely between the specific journal's editorial policies, the editors themselves, and me in my attempts not to be, to be constructive and not be that reviewer too. But if we're going to address these systemic issues, then we need to think through these deeper issues of power. Just to close it up as I throw it to Charlie, a couple of years ago when travel was still possible, I took these two students who both made amazing games to India to go to a local games show. It was a huge event, and we were told, bring a book. No one's going to be interested in your little university stand. But as you can kind of see here, we were totally mobbed with folks. One of the things that we discovered is that the usual twin stick controller that we were completely used to and thought of as normal around the world, 3D environment, twin stick controls, that was something that a lot of the people who wanted to play the game had no idea. They had to be taught how to do that, because there is so much more mobile gaming in India. Consoles are kind of like luxury products and beyond the reach of a lot of folks. So I think diversity is not just a question of inclusion. It's a question of are we doing good research? If we have a certain person in mind when we're designing our research questions, then we can only ever be giving a partial point of view on the reality of games. Okay, so that's where I'll step back and point out a bit of diversity where I could make some major strides, which is languages. I'm always taking advantage of the English language, this kind of platform. I've been invited to so many places to speak, and that hospitality is really appreciated from multilingual people. But I can throw to someone who is an expert, who I'm very privileged to be supervising, to talk about her own work in the language space. So, Charlie, do you want to take it away?
Yeah. Okay.
Just before you begin, Charlie, thank you so much, Darshana. And just to be clear about time, I have to be conscious of time because we have another event at 10. So Charlie, we want to hear everything that you prepared for us. And if that means that we don't have a time for a Q&A during this session, we'll be happy to organize a gathering on Gather Town, for instance, to exchange, because there are so many things I'm sure that people would like to say at this point. But the priority is hearing what you have to say, so you can take it all the way to 10 if you want to, Charlie.
Okay, thank you. I will try and talk quickly. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to share my screen as well. First off, I would like to say thank you very much to Carl and to Charlotte for organizing this, and thank you very much for Darshana to invite me along, because that's awesome. In particular, I want to say thank you to Charlotte for recognizing Scotland as a separate country and not just saying I'm British, because I'm not British, I'm Scottish, and it's very very important to us. It's a national identity, it's who we are. And so that meant an awful lot. So thank you very much, Charlotte. And to sort of reiterate what Darshana said there, I've been the only Scot in a whole city in China, very small city, only like 12,000 people, or 12 million people, sorry. And the only person from my country, my culture. And that's really hard. That's a really hard thing to do when you have no frame of recognition. There's no one like you. There's no one with the same sort of ideas, likes, cultural pinpoints. So it is very tricky. So the only Scot in Fuzhou, and again, to touch on something Darshana mentioned there, I've been lucky enough to work with some amazing Indigenous scholars over the last couple of years. One in particular, Beth Leponce, is an Indigenous Métis scholar, games designer, professor. She's absolutely awesome. But when working on a book chapter, I asked if she would like to collaborate with me. And she told me, and this is something that really upset me at the time, it's actually more powerful for me as a white person to write a paper and cite her than for her to co-author something with me. And that's something that really kind of stuck with me. It shouldn't be that way at all. So anyway, so my project is the Kilted Otter Initiative. I am extremely lucky to have Darshana as my supervisor. And as you heard, very, very intelligent man. So I'm just going to babble after him, I'm afraid. So I work at Aberdeen University in School of Design and Informatics, and I work in a division called Games and Arts Research. So the Kilted Otter Initiative, what is it? It's a research-based extended Gaelic game jam focusing on exploring Scottish culture, Scottish heritage, language, and it's open to anyone and everyone. When we say research-based, a lot of jams have kind of like a theme, so mother or climate, something like that. We don't have a theme word. We gave our participants a research pack, and in that pack were all different categories, so folklore, history, songs, famous people, and we collated lots and lots of research on those topics. Our participants then used that research as a way of inspiring game ideas. And it's extended because, I mean, I don't have time to devote a whole weekend to just doing games, let alone a week. So we put it over 2 months, and then that way everyone can take part. So we've got schools taking part, we've got working people taking part, we've got mothers at home, we've got everyone is able to take part, because 1 or 2 hours a week over 2 months actually equates to the same amount of time that you would put in a week-long or weekend jam. We've been very, very lucky to be funded and supported by the Scottish Government, Bord na Gàidheal, who are the sort of government Gaelic arm, MG Alapa, who is a Scots Gaelic Multimedia Association, Aberdeen University, and Women in Games. We're very lucky for that. And the project has created collaborative experiences which make games design and Gaelic accessible to all. And it embeds Gaelic within games to ensure it's not lost from Scottish culture. The jam is to be held annually, and each year we're predicting to expand to more Indigenous communities and cultures. So next year, for example, we're expanding to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we're already in works to set this one up. But why? So this is one of the main questions. Indigenous language is intrinsically linked to our heritage and our cultural identity. We're not a homogenous nation. As I said before, I'm Scottish, I'm not English, I'm not British. I identify as Scottish, and my Scottish culture, my Indigenous language makes me who I am. But Many of these indigenous languages are dying, and when they die, a little bit of our heritage goes as well. And Scots Gaelic has been steadily declining, partly due to things in history like the clearances, but also with people from the islands moving back into the big cities, so life can be a bit more convenient for them. This is the sad fact. Scots Gaelic faces demise within the next decade without promotion or support. That's within 10 years, a huge portion of my culture and heritage could just be gone. So here's a graph from University of Highlands and Islands, and you can see in 2021, less than half the people in the Western Isles are projected to have the ability to speak Gaelic. This is heritage speakers. We are trying to encourage new speakers. Partially is because the majority of Indigenous language speakers are elderly, and this is the same for all over the world. There's unfortunately been a situation where Indigenous languages are treated as the languages of the uneducated. If you're educated, you speak English, or you speak the main language of your country. So for example, in China, if you're educated, you speak Putonghua Chinese, and you speak English. You don't speak your local dialect because that's the language of uneducated. And I'm not saying that's the same for everyone, but there is a general sort of feeling like that. MG Alipa have stated that they wish to tap into the 16 to 30-year-old demographic. This is an age range which at present isn't really engaged with Scots Gaelic because the majority of speakers are elderly, so it's not seen as a young or vital language. Furthermore, our stakeholders have expressed a desire to gain knowledge into how Scots Gaelic learning can be enhanced with the integration of new media, such as gaming. And this is where I step in, because this is my particular field of interest. I was going to say expertise, but not yet. It's my area of interest. But why are we bothering? So I wrote a chapter, and in that chapter, I interviewed a Maori games designer and scholar, a Lakota Sioux games designer and scholar, a Métis American scholar, professor, games designer, and two Anishinaabe people from the First Nations in Canada, as well as Scots nationals. And I asked them this question, and this question is, why bother preserving heritage or language or culture if it's old, if it's not modern? And the answers that came back demonstrated that there is a real desire to preserve Indigenous heritage. And this often comes from the extremely unfortunate experience of having aspects of their culture taken away from them by force, by colonialism, that kind of thing. And there's a deep desire to reclaim those aspects of culture, to reclaim the right to be who they are, and to reclaim the pride in themselves and in their culture. This is also tied to the idea that if language dies, it can take cultural identity with it. Problems arise when there aren't enough people left who possess the language or who know enough words to be able to translate or conceptualize a tradition so that others can understand. And this came from a Lakota Sioux games designer who born and raised on a reservation, but there are things that are old traditions that can't be conceptualized now because the people who would have the language, the knowledge holders to express this properly are not around anymore. And so that's a whole chunk of history and culture that is just gone. The caveat is that language, heritage, and culture are not separate entities, and that for all of them to thrive, they must be treated as a whole. You can't separate them. You can't preserve a language without the culture that goes behind it. But it must be borne in mind that some Indigenous practices should not be played with. They are deeply spiritual, they're not for gamifying, and they're not for sharing with outsiders. And so this comes into a theory called nothing about us without us, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So the Games Jam, research-based extended Games Jam held over 2 months. We have a series of corresponding lectures from academic and industry experts. series of lectures for absolute beginners, introducing some of the best non-coding game engines and sites, meaning anyone can pick them up and play. And also we're providing mentors and guidance along the way. What this has meant is our participation stats are actually pretty impressive as far as I'm concerned. So in our first ever run, we've had 54 teams signed up. That's amazing. I was worried that no one would want to join, and I was thinking if I was lucky, I would get 10 teams, and here we are with 54. But what's really interesting is over 50% of our signups are female. This is because we haven't necessarily purposely marketed towards females, but we haven't purposely marketed towards males. So we're more gender neutral. We haven't got pixelated art. We haven't got game controllers. We haven't made it obviously computer games in our signups and our posters, because as soon as people see that, they assume it's coding, they assume it's computer science, they assume it's for boys only. So our way has had really significant female uptake. We have 16 schools, we have university students, we even have a team of industry professionals, as well as adults trying for the first time, participants from at least 5 different countries, Scotland, of course, but Ireland, Pakistan, the United States, and England. All levels of Gaelic, from none to native, and within our Discord, we have Gaelic channels, and people are using them. People are really enjoying the fact that there's a space where they can practice Gaelic in an open and safe environment. You're allowed to make mistakes. We also have all levels of game designability, from none to professional. So the impact, collaboration and networking is the preservation of language and cultural stories, connection during difficult times, skill learning. Obviously, being from a university, there's an academic research output, so we have papers and conferences, that kind of thing. But more importantly, we have the creation of a model for further language and cultural games practice. So the growth, I'm going through these reasonably quickly because I'm mindful of time and there's stuff I want to talk about at the end. So the jam is to be held annually, and each year we're going to expand, like I said before. Next year, we'll bring in Aotearoa, hopefully the First Nations from Canada and American Indian as well, probably Lakota Sioux, as we have connections with them. But this will make the Kilted Otter Initiative a global culture and language sharing experience. And this is in line with UNESCO's Decade of Indigenous Languages, 2022 to 2032. But I worked on a project with Anishinaabe people, First Nations in Canada. And one of the ideas was that the students were to create digital solutions for social issues faced by the Indigenous communities. When we asked for the evaluation of the efficacy of these digital products, it was kind of somewhat well. It was okay, but it wasn't great. When we delve a little deeper into the reasons why it was just seen as being okay, it was because the Indigenous peoples were not contacted. They were not involved in the co-design, in the co-development of these products. So this is the phrase, nothing about us, without us, and this comes from the Elder Morris Switzer from the First Nations, Mississaugas of Scugog Island in Ontario. It's the idea that as a Scot, as someone native to this land, if you want to make a game about Highlanders or the Highland clearances, but you want to do that and you don't involve any Scottish people at all in the design, the development, the research, you're not going to make an authentic game. And this is the idea where don't make something about people without including them, but also don't assume you know what people want or need. It's this method called two-eyed seeing. And this came from the Mi'kmaq elder, Albert Marshall. And it's taking the best of Indigenous pedagogies. And please bear in mind, science and medicine were not invented by white European males in the 18th century. Science and medicine have existed for as long as people have existed. They just weren't labeled science and medicine. So it's taking the indigenous pedagogies and methodologies and marrying them with a more Eurocentric Western pedagogy methodology, and taking the best of both worlds, creating pure co-design and co-development to create products that actually work, that are needed, that fit for purpose, and building these relationships. Many of the indigenous peoples that we've been working with are obviously, and quite understandably, not distrustful, but cautious about creating relationships because they have been burnt a lot in the past. And these kind of colonial scars take a very, very long time to heal. Just the buildup of a genuine relationship. And part of that relationship, which I'm very, very proud to have, is with Dr. Phyllis Callahan, who is a Maori. And we're working on something we can't really talk about just now, but I can give you a hint. So this is something that we're working against. This is from a game. I don't need to say the name of the game. It looks perfectly acceptable. But if we look at the main character and you look at his chin, that is Timoka. That is a female Maori tattoo on his chin. This is the tattoo that is the spiritual. It's the embodiment of the woman's spirit, family, history, culture. And it's a very, very spiritual tattoo. But they've put it on a male. This isn't acceptable. And when the designer of the game was questioned about this in a big open session, he just laughed it off and said, well, obviously it's not a Maori character then, because a Maori male wouldn't have that. It's not really fair to make a joke about these things. If you get something wrong, you should change it. You should apologize. So this is something that a project we're away to start is really focusing on. But with just 2 minutes left to go. So this is the Kilted Otter Initiative, Game Jam 2021. Sponsored by MG Alibi, the Scottish Government, Bord na Gàidheal, Abertay University, and Women in Games. And if anyone would like any more information about it, please feel free to contact me at kiltedotter@gmail.com. It's an easy enough email to remember. And I think that's me finished talking.